I am today going to talk about HCI and design jobs, especially for new college graduates. So I'm really excited to talk in these sorts of introductory classes because it's important, I think, to reach the students as early as possible in your college careers. And so the goal of this talk is to give first an overview of the field of human-computer interaction and design, and then more importantly, show what kinds of jobs you can get with a degree in HCI or a specialization, as you might get in cognitive science in HCI and design. So this talk is going to go very, very, very fast, and there's a lot of dense text on these slides. So don't worry if you don't get all of it. The slides will all be up afterwards. I'll put up on the website. Professor Boyle will put them up. So the point of this hour is just to give you just a first introduction to a lot of stuff, and then you can go and read these slides and they'll link to resources later on your own time. And because of that, I'm going to wait until the end to take questions. I'm probably going to take up the entire hour, pretty much. And then afterwards, when everyone leaves, if you all have questions for me afterwards, I'm happy to stick around for questions. So first of all, there's a lot of HCI design activity at UC San Diego. So a lot of this revolves around this interdisciplinary research center called the Design Lab that was started about 4 to 5 years ago. If you look at the Design Lab website, there's a lot of faculty and staff in many different departments, including many in cognitive science. And along with that, there are dozens of graduate students and undergraduate students working in the lab. So it's really a confluence of activity in HCI design from different areas. So you're on a really good campus for this sort of work to be happening in both teaching and research. HCI design is a super, super diverse field. So everybody you meet who you're going to talk to about HCI design is going to have their own take on what it means to them. And I'm just going to try to cover the very basics in this hour. So a good starting point for talking about what HCI and design is to give an overview of one of our largest introductory classes, which is called COGS 120, and it's also cross-listed in computer science and engineering called CSE 170. And this course is taught every year by Professor Scott Clemmer and then by myself as well. So I'm going to give you a really quick overview of what we do in this class as a point of reference for what you can expect from kind of a career in HCI and design. So in this class, you'll learn about a human-centered design process. And you learn about this by not only studying the theory, but by actually building some kind of a mobile or web application that's specifically targeted for some user population. And through this hands-on process, you learn this entire design process. So here is a rough overview of what we cover in the class. So we start with need finding. And then we go all the way down to doing sketches and doing prototypes, doing testing, and then delivering some kind of final app in 10 weeks. So the first step is called need finding, which is basically what it implies. It's finding the user need. So what should we even build in the first place? And then in the prototyping phases, we try to answer the question of how should we start building this? And then what should it look and feel like? And then when we actually test on users to deploy experiments, how can we measure how well it actually works on people? And then finally, how can we ship a somewhat finished product? So the first need finding stage is that what we want to do is observe potential users in their natural habitat. We might want to do direct observation. We might want to interview them. We might want to send out surveys. We want to find out what their real problems and needs are. And this is a sign I really like from Y Combinator, which is a startup investment firm, and their motto is called "Make Something People Want." And while that's a good motto, somebody in one of their offices scratched out the want word and actually put in need. It's hard to see down here, but it actually says need in handwriting. And I thought that was really great because it really exemplifies this whole point of need findings. That people might want or say they want all sorts of things, but in fact, when you actually see what their core problems are, you see their real needs, which are often not something they can come up with or speak out loud. So you really have to investigate in detail. And after you find out these needs, we go through this process of drawing storyboards, drawing sketches, making prototypes on paper that are low fidelity kind of sketches so that we can put it in front of users and get feedback. So you can see this video yourself when you see the slides later, but these paper prototypes are basically just hand-drawn user interfaces with components you can swap in and out. So you can actually quickly test to see whether your interactions work without actually writing any code, which is really cool. And then when you're satisfied with your paper prototypes, you actually will move on to using computer-based tools like sketching tools, Photoshop, Illustrator, other sorts of mock-up tools to make higher quality prototypes. And then later you're actually going to write real code to make it into a working application. Then we do some science in the course. So we actually get real people to test this on. So we either bring it again to their natural habitats in the field to test, we can bring users into a lab to test on them, or we can deploy experiments online and collect and analyze that data at scale. So one really good example of this sort of online deployment that's been in use in the past decade or more is doing what's called A/B testing on websites. So very famously, President Obama, in his first presidential campaign in 2008, his campaign team was one of the first to employ a lot of these data analytics techniques. So they tried to tweak the homepage with showing different pictures on the homepage, and then also showing different sign-up buttons and different variations of buttons. And then they can basically deploy different variations and measure the sign-up rates, measure how many people click through and sign up with different sorts of logos. So they iterated on a bunch of designs, and in the end, this was the one that won out. This family picture, this kind of monochrome, simple family picture, the change we can believe in slogan, and the learn more button instead of a sign up button. And by making these incremental tweaks and measuring their impact on user signups, they could actually quantify how much more money they made. So they actually end up getting approximately $60 million more in campaign donations from tweaking these sorts of features. And this is being used every day in every company website you visit, right? So if you're on Amazon, if you're at Google, if you're on Netflix, all of these sites are continually doing these experiments and actually testing on all of us who are visiting a site to see our behaviors. So this is a really big field of study. And finally, products are really never done. They just get shipped. So at the end of 10 weeks, we don't expect you to make something that's completely polished, but we want you to have something that you can show off and ship. And a quote that's famously attributed to Steve Jobs is called "Real artists ship." So we don't know if he actually said this, but this is what the lore, the folklore says. Is that this idea is that even if we think of ourselves as artists or as craftspeople or as designers, nothing really has an impact in the world unless we ship the product out or we ship the actual project. So this is kind of a kind of rallying cry against perfectionism, is that there is some due date, we need to make something good enough to put out there, and then we can iterate on the next version, right? Like, once it's out there, we continually improve it. So this is a super quick overview of what you will learn in an introductory type of HCI course. And I want to use that as a basis for talking, for the rest of this, probably 40 or so minutes about jobs. So the outline is, talking about first kinds of design jobs, how to get one of these jobs out of college, and then what about going to do more schooling in different sorts of graduate school programs. So returning to the mantra of the introductory HCI course, the first step in the design process is need finding. So in fact, this talk was made with sort of this, it came about sort of due to this process. So in this way, it was called kind of find needing. I call it kind of backwards need finding. Instead of me going out to find user needs, the needs actually found me. So what ends up happening is a question I frequently get during office hours or after class when I'm teaching these introductory human-computer interaction and design classes is, what kind of jobs can I get if I'm an HCI and design student? And I'm not really the best person to answer this question for various reasons, I'll tell you, but I'm the one who's here right now. So I'm the best you've got right now. So I graduated from college quite a while ago, so about over a dozen years ago, with a degree in electrical engineering and computer science. So I came from a very heavy engineering and computer background, not really from a design or HCI background. And I've actually never worked as a professional designer before. But the greatest thing about being a professor, we can talk more about this at length later, is actually having access to all of you, right? It's actually having access to hundreds or even thousands, perhaps, of students per year who will later go on to become alumni who will become experts in this area. So, many of you in 5 years and 10 years will become experts in your respective fields, whatever career path you go down. And I can actually call on you to give me advice for what to do about this talk. So when I get these questions a lot, I actually just turn to an impromptu panel of job experts who were my former students, either in my classes or my research lab. So I'm going to introduce 4 of these people on this panel, and then I'm going to talk about, there are more people who contributed feedback afterwards. So this is Carolyn. She went to MIT and she majored in computer science, and she graduated in 2014. That's about 4 years ago, and she's currently been working as a designer at a smallish design agency. And there's Emily Danchik. She went to the University of Rochester, where I used to teach. She was a double major in computer science and linguistics, and then she later did a master's degree in HCI at Carnegie Mellon. And she's currently a UX architect at a large information technology consulting firm. And she used to be a UX interaction designer at Microsoft. There's Emmy Lin. She was also at Rochester, same major incidentally. Double majors. She's currently a software developer at Intel, so she works more in software development, but she's interested in doing more HCI-facing things from the more software end. And then finally, Carrie Kai. Carrie was majored in nothing related to HCI or design, or even computer science in undergrad. She was a human biology undergrad, and she got her master's in education, and then she went back to school to do a PhD in computer science, focusing on HCI. And she's currently a research scientist working at Google. So these folks kind of span a large number of different sorts of majors, different sorts of educational backgrounds, from bachelor's to master's to PhD, and they have different sorts of roles in industry. And the main disclaimer here is all of these insights are theirs. I've kind of pooled together their insights to make this set of slides. And any of the mistakes or kind of misconceptions here are kind of my own doing of my own misinterpretation. And as you've seen, I've created this talk itself using this human-centered design process by soliciting these user needs and feedback from this target population to kind of make this talk. And hopefully in the future, I can call on you to add your insights to here as well. So, besides the 4 people on the panel, I also, at the end, you'll see in the appendix and the credits, there's about a dozen other people who've looked at various incarnations of these slides and given me feedback and things to add and such. So this is probably now the product of over a dozen people working in various HCI and design fields. So I think this is going to be a much more representative sample of what HCI design jobs are than if I had just made up something myself, right, as someone who has not worked directly hands-on in the field. And I think that this sort of philosophy, at a meta level is really important, of kind of getting the feedback of people who are actually working on the ground in the field and then pulling it together and trying to organize it in a useful way to disseminate to all of you. And then hopefully in a few years, you'll be the ones who can give me additional feedback on this. Okay. Let's get started. So if you remember only one slide from this talk, this is the one. So if you want to get an HCI design job, there are 3 main components. So first, you want to build up a design portfolio. And then you want to really lean hard on your connections. So both your personal connections and also alumni from the school. And then finally, try to get some kind of design-related internship while you're in college. Now, these are great prerequisites for putting you in a strong position to do job hunting and to maximize your chances of getting interviews. And then there's a whole other art to, to doing well in interviews and passing the interviews and getting the full-time job offer. But these are really the prerequisite things for getting your foot in the door. And if you notice, none of these things are directly taught in your classes, right? So this is why it's really important, I think, for early stage students especially to see this, because, if you're planning 3-4 years out when you're about to graduate, or 5 years out, or 10 years out and later in your career, it's really important to have these in the back of your head as early as possible so you can start taking action on them. And many students and alumni I talk to wish they had learned what's in this talk at the very beginning of college, because it does take a lot of time to think about this stuff. It's not something that just happens overnight. So what jobs are available? So conveniently, these jobs correspond pretty well to what you learn in an introductory HCI and design course, like the one I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. So this, again, is a recap of what you learn typically in HCI and design course, all these phases of the design process. And all of these questions correspond to job roles that you will be able to get in industry if you work in this field. So I'm just going to roughly put kind of a correspondence of names of job titles with the process parts of the design process. So what kind of jobs allow you to do this? So For doing need finding and storyboarding, kind of finding user needs, sketching out user stories of like figuring out like what people want, how people want to interact with things. These roles are sometimes called UX researchers, which stands for user experience researchers, or PMs, which are often called product managers or project managers. So these are the folks who are often involved in the early stages of the process of getting user needs. They often come from many kinds of backgrounds. And they don't necessarily do a lot of the, say, the programming or the actual building of the apps, right? They're really soliciting needs. And then to do paper prototyping or this sort of prototyping, these are sometimes called UX designers or user experience designers. You might have people who are more visual or graphics designers who are kind of specializing in making the aesthetics look good. So, colors, fonts, alignment, flows and such, animations. And then there are kind of, when you start making prototypes that are a bit more interactive, that have moving parts that connect to each other, those are sometimes called interaction designers. UX designers also do this as well. Sometimes they're called UX architects or UX prototypers. As you can tell, there's a lot of names being floated around. And people who do user testing, they're often UX researchers. And to do experiments, again, UX researchers do this. Data scientists might also do this. So again, just like the President Obama campaign example, if you're launching these experiments online and collecting a lot of log data, you want to parse through it. You want to clean the data. You want to analyze it. You want to do statistics. You want to do visualizations. This kind of emerging role of data science is really important in this as well. So I think data science goes really well with user experience and HCI in this regard of running experiments. And then finally, the people who are coding up the final mobile or web app to implement the project are sometimes called front-end developers or product engineers or just general software engineers. So these are people who are usually the ones with more of a computer programming background who are implementing the final product. So as you can see, like these teams have many kinds of different roles and they're called different things, and these job titles can be fairly confusing. So, if you actually are on the job market and you see these job titles, different companies call the same jobs by different names, and these names change pretty quickly. Even in the dozen or so people that I talked to, no one really quite agreed on what these names were called. Some people argued that these people did this role. It's all very fuzzy. So one advice that someone gave was to read the job descriptions themselves for a more detailed definition of what they want in this position, and also ask the companies, the recruiters or the managers when you're interviewing, what they really want for this role. Because usually they might want to hire for a particular role, but they put some generic job ad up. So again, just don't be dissuaded if these job titles just seem very, very vague. So here's a really, really high-level overview of these job titles. And the disclaimer here is that you may work in multiple roles in one job. And this is usually called wearing many hats, right? So it's kind of like you wear the hat of a designer and of a researcher and of an implementer. Like you might, this is all, again, very amorphous. So the UX researcher, again, does a lot of need finding. They do user testing and experiments. They do more of the research kind of roles. These often have master's or PhD level degrees. Of course, it's not required, but the general trend is that they have some kind of graduate level research degree. Product managers do a lot of the need finding as well, and they also manage the project. They kind of coordinate the team members, they organize meetings, they organize design documents, milestones, a lot of the infrastructure and glue that keeps the project kind of moving forward. UX or interaction or product designers often do prototypes. They build stuff, but they often don't use code. This is often the most common kind of job for new college grads to get into, ones without graduate level degrees. So there's a lot of these jobs for UX designers or interaction designers. And then there's slightly more coding oriented jobs. Again, these names vary, but sometimes they're called architects or prototypers, and these folks do design and also some kind of coding, usually kind of web front-end coding. Visual designers do art and graphics work, more visual work. Data scientists do data analysis. Often these are PhD level positions with a lot of experience crunching numbers and doing statistics. And then front-end developers are the ones who write a lot of production code. These are the ones who are actually writing, say, the HTML and the JavaScript code, or sometimes the code on the server as well. Sometimes people use this word product designer. So again, this is just giving you the impression that these roles are quite varied. Okay, so now that we know what the roles are available, how do you actually get one of these jobs? So again, going back to my one slide summary, we want portfolio, connections, and internships. So the basic formula looks something like this, that you have some sort of portfolio, and that added together with some kind of personal connections gets you into internship type positions. And then the internship experiences hopefully lead to a full-time job, either at the same firm or at different firms, because internships help boost your resume, help you kind of stand out amongst the crowd of students more, and help you get interviews for full-time jobs. I mean, you don't need all of these paths, but this is one typical route that students go through. Okay, let's start with the portfolio. So this is the biggest part, and the part that perhaps takes the most time. So the basic idea behind a portfolio is that you want to make some kind of personal website, right, that showcases your work. In the old days, people had portfolios that were on paper, and still in a lot of art and design schools, you might have a large paper-bound portfolio because you're doing paper sketches and artistic sketches that are paper. But for these sorts of interaction design positions, everything is electronic, and most things are either on the web, or if you're making mobile apps or other kinds of device interactions, you can probably make a video of it, right, and put it on YouTube and embed it on your website. So everything should be on a personal website. A good starting point for portfolios is class projects with the design component. So, for example, the Intro HCI classes usually have some final project that includes a design component. Many of the classes we now have a design minor. We have in cognitive science, there's quite a few design-oriented classes. Just look for classes where there are project components, and you can include those in your portfolio. This is just a starting point, though, because you'll find that many of the students who are applying for these internships will have at least the class projects, but you want to start somewhere. To going beyond classes, think about how do you help on-campus groups or friends with their projects. So like if you can find opportunities in your living group, in your special interest groups on campus, friends who need help with any kind of design work whatsoever, just be resourceful at finding that kind of work and just putting that in your portfolio. Because most of the times these groups are, you're making flyers, you're making websites, you're making simple apps for certain kinds of one-off things. They'll be okay with you showing all this publicly because they're showing it publicly anyways, and you can put those in your portfolio. So again, looking beyond just making the standard sorts of apps, you can think about posters, art pieces, public art, event flyers, or even business or marketing slide decks. So if you have friends who are interested in business sort of stuff and they want help making their slides, less less boring than a bunch of bullet points that I have here, right? If you want their slides to be more visually appealing or more convincing, I think that you can help them, design these sorts of things and include those in your portfolio. So just basically whatever kinds of project with some kind of design component, try to include that in. Other kind of basic portfolio things is, if you want to go a bit beyond that, you can work part-time while you're in school. So, there are many students who work part-time in research labs, say, or in student organizations. Try to find these opportunities to work part-time, 10 hours a week or so as a freelance designer. So there might be local companies that need some kind of help for like making sketches for their homepage, or even making designs or diagrams, or even coding up simple pages. Or, if your friends are starting up companies and they, can't afford to hire people who've graduated from college and they will need to rely on their friends to help them out, these are great opportunities as well. So I just think that being on a college campus gives you a lot of these sort of opportunities for part-time work. But you have to really go out of your way to find them, I think. These won't come kind of by default, right? Again, like I mentioned earlier, these are not directly part of your classes, but the colleagues and former students I have who've been successful in this career path, many of them have done these sorts of things. That's why I'm including them in these slides. And then once you get some kind of design internship, try to put that in your portfolio as well. Some kinds of work are public facing, so you can put in portfolio. Some kinds of work are not as public facing, so you might not be able to. Another really good piece of advice people had is to look at your friends and also alumni's portfolios and resumes as examples, right? So, oftentimes, if you think about before going to a career fair, you might well look at the resumes of your friends who have gotten these sorts of jobs the year before just to see how they format things. And it's the same goes for portfolios. And I think this is why it's, again, really important to be well connected to the community of both your friends and also alumni in this area, because they're the ones who can kind of share this work with you. And if you don't know people, you can just look online, right? Look online, for on LinkedIn for people from UC San Diego or various schools, and look at their personal websites and portfolios. And most of this stuff is public, so you can actually look online for a lot of people's portfolios as well. So some more advanced things, again, you don't have to worry about this right away, but I'll put this on for reference. So I think it's really important for a portfolio, and also when you're interviewing, to have what's called a compelling and fresh point of view. So the idea here is that you want to, when people are interviewing you or such, you want people to remember you as having some kind of interesting point of view about your work. So you want to avoid kind of general cliches like, I'm passionate about making innovative progress at scale, or just kind of throwaway lines that you might put on your website that, or on the first line of a resume that doesn't really say much, right? It's like, I'm looking for a design job, or I'm passionate about design. But like, everybody who wants these jobs is passionate about X or Y, right? So I think you'll start finding your own kind of voice as you do more of this work. That's why I put this in the advanced section. Don't worry about this up front. The idea is that once you have a body of work, you'll start thinking about what draws this together and what inspires you in this way. I know it sounds really abstract now if you don't have a portfolio, but once you've done, say, 3 or 4 projects, you'll start seeing, oh, maybe I'm really into doing mobile development for my local community, or maybe I'm really into doing things that are multilingual interfaces because I happen to be bilingual or from a multicultural background. It really does vary for each person. There's not a one size fits all. Another really important thing about the portfolio and about interviewing and using your portfolio for interviews is being able to justify and critique your own design process. So it's all about process. So the idea is that, if you have 2 people who have the exact same portfolio and they say like, oh, I made this mobile app for my class or for a friend's student club. And if one person is just, not able to answer or talk coherently about why they made the choices they did, why did they make this the way they did, what needs do they have, what feedback do they get along the way, what mistakes do they make, it just wouldn't sound as impressive as someone else who had the exact same app they made, but they actually could talk in depth about, okay, we got user needs from this way, and then we tried to make this thing, and we thought that people would like it, but in fact they use it in a completely different way. That really surprised us, and we had to go back to the drawing board and try these 2 other things, and you can show in your portfolio perhaps all these failed iterations. And the failures are interesting, right? So it shows that you've gone through a process, and people know that things aren't going to work out the first time. Again, it's just justifying what you did, how you did it, and also why it matters. Right, so you can imagine making all sorts of iterations and prototypes, but if it's just kind of randomly fumbling around, switching colors and stuff, maybe it doesn't matter that much. But if you're, I'm just making an example. If you're like, we tested on a bunch of people, and we actually found that a lot of people we tested on were, over the age of 50, and some of them had vision problems, so we couldn't have our low contrast artistic color scheme. We needed to have higher contrast fonts and have clear menu labels because our target population was a bit older than we originally intended. We originally intended this for college students, but in fact a lot of people who liked this were our parents' age. So these sorts of background and process stories really adds to your portfolio. And this is also, very important for dispelling a common myth that design is only about making things look good, right? So a lot of people, when they don't know about design, they just say, oh yeah, design, art, that just means like making stuff look pretty, making, really good looking colors and fonts and layouts. But in fact, the field is really about making stuff that's ultimately beneficial to real users. And, aesthetics are part of it, but a lot of it is about the functionality and the actual match to the audience, right? So you can imagine something that looks really great to all of you, but if you give it to your parents to use, they can't really find any value in it, and then it's not really a success. Okay, so another part of the portfolio is, this is again getting a bit more advanced, is that it's okay to show how you improved on an existing product rather than creating your own from scratch. So a lot of times when you're just starting in class projects or hobby projects or projects on campus, you're probably creating something more or less from scratch because it's more of a canned activity. But if you're doing an internship, or if you're, say, working with a student club that has, or some kind of school organization that has an existing website or has an existing mobile app or has an existing kind of template for what they're doing, you often can't just scrap that and do your own from scratch, even if you're like, oh, I just want to remake everything. But in the real world, you often can't just remake everything. right? And you often have to make incremental changes to what's already there because there are constraints in the way. You know, people are already used to how something looks and feels and works. You can't just totally upend that. And that's okay, because some people are afraid that, oh, maybe I'll just show that I'm not as creative and I can't just make something from scratch. But actually, in fact, you know, this might come off as more authentic because people know that in the real world, you're going to be doing stuff that is actually working on existing systems, right? It's like you're probably never going to be just scrapping everything at your company and making everything from scratch again, because there's just so much at stake already. So, you know, these sorts of improvements and talking about why you made improvements is actually, it can be a good thing. So again, just don't discount any of the work you've done just because you feel like, oh, this is just improving someone else's thing. This is not completely my own thing. It's all good to put in there. And you want to emphasize the most relevant projects to your job roles. So again, this is when you're a bit more advanced, when you have a lot of projects, you want to showcase the ones for the kinds of jobs you want, right? So if you want a more coding-oriented role, you might want to put the projects up top where you did a lot of the programming and that was more intricate. If you want a more visual design role, you want to put the projects up top that were more visually oriented. Okay, so the second part is the personal connections. So this, the idea behind this is that, you know, relying on the connections that you build in university especially is just really important because you're going to have this network of alumni, especially recent alumni, that you can call on for help. And, you know, cold emailing people often seems like it might be intimidating, but in fact, it actually works reasonably well, especially if they have some kind of connection to your department or your lab or your student group or your living group and stuff. A lot of times these alumni might put themselves on certain kinds of mailing lists. So if you're in a special living group or kind of some group on campus, you know, alumni often keep themselves on the mailing list. And just feel free to email them. I mean, people are usually happy to respond to these things. And if they're not, you know, as long as you write a short, well, you know, polite message, people understand that, you know, college students are looking for jobs. So as long as you're not just spamming random people, I think it's okay to do. And then just cold email alumni regardless, right? And just think about, you know, your friends, your family, dorm mates, instructors, you know, going to people's office hours, just asking if there's any interesting opportunities. It helps just to ask, because even if people don't have anything, you know, directly for you, it's like, you know, people are not like, oh, I have an exact job offer from my friend that you can interview for. Oftentimes they might point you in the right direction, and just getting yourself out there and asking people is really the only way, because, you know, most of us start out in the beginning of college, right, not really knowing anybody in the field, and eventually we get to know people just from this very organic, natural process. But it's really important to have a good portfolio, right? Because if you don't have the portfolio in the first place, that's why I put portfolio before connections. If you don't have much in the first place to show, it's hard for them to see a sense of what you do. So you really got to develop this in parallel. Also, if you have prior jobs or internships, even if they might not be in the most related field, just ask your bosses, right? So like, that's why it's important to do well in your internships or your jobs, because, you know, your bosses or managers or senior coworkers will probably know relevant people who do something else. They're like, oh, wow, this person did a really good job for me last summer. Oh yeah, I had a friend who might want help doing X or Y, or I'll just keep you in mind. So these things always help, right? It always helps just to do a good job on things. And many, many, many good jobs are obtained by some kind of personal connection. That's just, you know, in my years of kind of seeing how these things have worked among students, it is, you know, if you're applying for jobs just purely online, you're kind of, you know, putting your resume in a big hat with thousands or tens of thousands of other applicants. You know, we all kind of need to figure out some way to make ourselves stand out, and relying on our personal work is a kind of tried and true way. Another good use of personal connections, like your friends or alumni, is to have them critique your portfolio, your resume, or even your cover letters for jobs. Again, these people can quickly give you feedback because they've gone through this process before, right? They're probably better than you know, people who are, you know, who are not in your field to do that, right? So I often think that this is a really important role for alumni. Okay, so on to internships. So preparing for interviews, so this happens for interviews for internships and full-time jobs, is think about being able to critique your portfolio, like I said earlier. Think about going through your process, basically being able to intelligently answer questions and hold a conversation about the work you've done. That's the core of a lot of these interviews. There's a lot of resources that I'll link to. Mostly. So another thing with internships is that if you want a future career in HCI and design, try to target more design-oriented internships. It may not always be possible. You might get an internship in a related area like doing kind of web programming and not as directly in design, but try to get as oriented as possible. Maybe front-end web developer. Ideally, you can put your internship work in your portfolio, but even if you can't, you can still probably talk through your design process. You can say, I work for a government firm and they were revamping their, internal IT system. I can't show you because it's some kind of proprietary thing, but this is in general what I did. And people understand. Obviously you want some things public that you can show, but if there are some things you can't show publicly, you can still talk about them. And if you can't get internships, especially if you're early on, it's really competitive, especially for early stage students to get internships, try to spend your summers building your portfolio in any way you can, right? So if you're home, if you're on campus taking classes, try to seek out these opportunities to build a portfolio, however you can. Okay, so another thing about applying for jobs is that when you're nearing the end of college and thinking about applying for full-time jobs, it is a full-time job to do this pretty much. I mean, you will be pretty busy in your last year doing this, and it will be a stressful and a long process. And I think a big piece of advice here is to apply broadly, and don't worry if you don't exactly match the job descriptions. So again, these job descriptions could be vague, they could be outdated, they could be just some generic text that the company puts up there, even though the managers want something kind of custom. It's really worthwhile to apply to places and to keep organized. And don't have your heart set on any one specific place just because it's just difficult, right? I mean, there's a lot of luck involved. It depends on whether they're hiring, whether there are other candidates that might be a better fit. Successful applicants all apply to up to dozens of jobs. So people keep track of their application process using a spreadsheet, and also take the time to customize your resumes and cover letters for companies if that's appropriate, because it just kind of helps you stand out in a way and just kind of shows you're putting in that extra effort. A note on company size. This is in general, working for a smaller company, you can have more diverse and varied roles. So, if you're at a startup company that's small, you may do a bunch of things. You might do some need finding, some coding. You may even get into doing some marketing and business work. So the N=1 case, if you're just working for yourself as a freelancer, there's a lot of flexibility, right? Because you're basically your own boss trying to find clients. But there's a lot of uncertainty. That's a big minus there, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. You have to look for all your own jobs. You don't know whether you're getting a steady paycheck every month. At a tiny startup, you have a lot of variety in what you work on. You might have a lot of growth potential. That's another plus. That if your company does well, you might end up being, the VP of design or some really senior person that's managing a large team because you were their first designer. But there's also uncertainty, right? Many companies don't end up succeeding. They have a lot of turmoil early on. At a smallish design agency, you often get to work directly with clients. So these are design firms that contract out to clients, but you're working for a company, so you're not working for yourself. And then if you're an in-house designer at a big company, you usually have more fixed roles. So you often just do one specific part of that chain because you're at a bigger organization. That's not always true. So some companies don't have much experience with design yet. So if you're the first designer your group hires, it might be like a small company job where you do everything. So again, this just varies a lot, but I'm just giving you the very high-level overview. And then another thing is to look beyond the usual tech companies. So a lot of students, especially at career fairs, the really high-profile technology companies that's often the news are the ones that everyone is applying to work at. And while it's good to apply to work at all those places because you should apply everywhere you want, I think there's a lot of opportunities for HCI and design work beyond the usual places, right? So there may be companies that do retail, logistics, e-commerce, things that are not as directly consumer-facing. There may be government IT agencies. There's a lot of work, within government. I mean, the government is a gigantic organization, and everything is online and electronic now. There may be contractors who work with the government in various industries. There may be science labs that have a need for design work. There may be nonprofits as well. And I think the big takeaway on the slide is that these HCI design skills are often in demand. But these sectors can't as easily attract the most experienced designers because they're not on people's radar as much, right? So that in fact, I think if you get a job at these places, you might actually be able to make a bigger impact because you'll be the first person they hire who knows about the design process, and you might actually be able to really drive things if you're able to work within their organization. Whereas if you're at, say, a really established company with design like Apple, there are hundreds or thousands of designers, and you're playing one small, very fixed role, and you won't get to upturn everything. Also, looking beyond pure design jobs. So this is kind of a survey that was done a few years ago and said that over 90% of these experienced designers said that coding was actually important for the modern design jobs. In 2005, they did a similar survey 10 years ago, and very few people said so. This is an informal survey, but it gives us indication that within just a decade, the ability to write code has just become exponentially more important. The ideal ratio here is that there's one designer for every kind of 5 programmers or people implementing this in code. But in fact, many companies just don't hire that many designers. I mean, the kind of sobering reality is that there are not that many design jobs relative to pure programming jobs. So you might have a 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 30 ratio. So that means that a good adjacent role is doing what's called front-end development. So that's usually making the user interfaces and the front-end, the user-facing parts of the code, like in a web application or a mobile application. So this is a pure coding job, but you're at least working with user-facing things. One hack you can do is you can build up some design portfolio on the side and learn from the designers on your team, and you might be able to transition more into a design role later. So some people start off, especially those from computer science backgrounds, start off doing front-end, say web development, and then maybe transition in design later. Another kind of note here is that a lot of places still don't value design as much, but everybody values programming because they understand that you need to write the code to ship your product. So if you have these design skills and you work as a programmer, you can actually sneak some of the design thinking in your workplace and maybe have them be more open to design roles in the future. Okay, so in the next few minutes, in the final few minutes, I want to talk about, so what if you can't find a full-time job right away? So, if you're graduating in a tough job market, if you haven't built up as much of the experience as many of your peers, it may be hard to find a role right away. So one idea is you can do freelance or contract design jobs. There are online resources for finding these jobs. You might, again, be able to find these jobs through your personal connections. And the idea is you can make some money from part-time work, which is good, right? So it's good to have money, but it's more importantly is to build up that portfolio and connections. That you just need to build up more portfolio, more connections, so you can launch yourself into the full-time jobs later on. And again, on the bottom here, the employers tend to value these real-world experiences more than kind of pre-made class or school projects. So actually, doing these contract jobs does help you because these are lines on your resume that are real positions you've had. Again, these are personal connections or online postings. Okay, the final I want to end on is, should you go to graduate school? This is a question that many people have. The first kind of graduate school is a master's level degree in HCI or design. So high-level answers are no if you already have a good portfolio and internship. So if you're well-positioned to get a design job out of college, you usually don't need to get a master's. So if you already can get a good job, maybe if you major in something that's really far from HCI and design, maybe that's a good thing to supplement your knowledge. Maybe if you want to teach, so many people who are instructors in design schools or professors of design schools have a MFA, which is a Master's in Fine Arts, or some kind of master's level degree in design. Definitely yes if you don't have a strong portfolio, if you just haven't built one up. If you didn't specialize in doing HCI and design work in college. And if you can afford tuition and time, right? Master's level degrees, they take money, they take time. And if you want to be a UX researcher doing more research level work, that's usually more geared toward graduate level degrees. Final one is, should you go to graduate school to get a PhD degree in HCI design? These usually take much longer, 5 to 6 years or more. The general consensus is no. So if you're aiming for most design-related jobs you want to get, you probably do not need a PhD level degree for it. So the answer is no for that. You're usually hired at maybe a slightly higher level than a bachelor's or master's level, but you probably are not significantly different. You're using many more years in school. Maybe if you want to be a UX researcher. Definitely yes if you want to be a university professor. So if you actually want to teach and do research at the university level, you oftentimes need a PhD. Yes if you want to be a research scientist, which is actually subtly different than UX researchers. So research scientists are the ones who are doing more of the R&D and science, and usually those are the PhD level roles. Despite these job titles, the research scientists do more open-ended exploratory research work, and the UX researchers kind of do research on the exact, product or the exact user population. And yes, if you want to be a data scientist. So the recap here is, if you want to get one of these jobs, build up the portfolio, lean hard on your connections, and get an internship while you're in college. And again, this is what many students and alumni have wished they heard about at the beginning of college. So here are some appendixes that I'll put on the slides. So these are some job hunting related resources. Another appendix here, you don't have to read the slides here, is about PM or product manager jobs, which often people who are interested in design get PM jobs, which are another adjacent roles. There's another career path you can think about going down. And there's some more information here. And here is a summary of the kinds of HCI and design jobs that you can get from your training. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions, but we could let everybody be dismissed, and people can come up here if you have questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much.